my clock, it's just a little bit after 9, so I think we're going to get started here. We'll probably have a few folks trickling in. I see Craig, our speaker for today, has joined us. Welcome, Craig. We're so excited to hear you talk. I think I enabled screen sharing for non-hosts, so if you want to give it a try, let me know. But as a brief introduction, I have to admit I haven't met Craig Ailovich personally, but his name is kind of already larger than life. He has a PhD, and he is kind of the go-to resource on agroforestry, especially in the Pacific. He's written countless books on it. He runs Agroforestry Net. It just is an incredible resource. He also, I believe, is still the editor for the Overstory, which is a journal on agroforestry. We're really, really pleased to have him speak today. You know, he's a fount of knowledge, so I know I'm looking forward to this talk and I'm going to be taking copious notes. Craig, let us know if there's anything we can do to help you, and otherwise we look forward to hearing from you.
Okay, aloha everyone. Good morning. I'm really pleased to be here and honored to be here. Thank you everyone for your time. I know everyone's very busy and it's a weekday morning, so this is my favorite thing to do is share what I've learned from so many teachers over the years. I've been here in Holualoa since 1988, and I've been learning every day since I got here. I'm still learning, and I think that's one of the keys to agroforestry, which is in real time observing nature, interacting with nature, and creating outcomes that benefit both nature and us as humans in so many ways. So thank you so much for having me today. I think we have a couple of hours to talk. Normally I do 2-day workshops, so I've tried to compress everything down today, and we're going to try to do something that I haven't done before, which is to walk out in some of the fields here on my farm and take a look at some of the things that I'll be talking about today. I'm just wondering, is there a way for us to, how do we interact today? Do we have questions that come in, or do people raise their hands? Maybe somebody can help me out there.
So normally the way we've done it is having folks put questions in the chat, or pass them, if they're in person, pass them to their coordinator. Just because there's so many people, it makes it a little challenging if everyone's piping up. But yeah, if there's specific things you want us to interact on, we can have folks temporarily unmute.
Okay, great. Well, for now, I'll just start going, getting the ball rolling. And I also have here Caitlyn Mahoney, who's studying here for a few weeks. She's going to talk a little bit about her project that she's been working on in terms of agroforestry. And also, as I said, we'll be going out in the field a little bit. So I think what I'll do is I'll start showing you some pictures. I'll do I'll start my PowerPoint going here. One moment. Okay, so through the years, I've had many shifts in my thinking about agroforestry. When I first came to Kona, I live in the Kona coffee region. I was inspired by the coffee fields, which were full of not just coffee, but other trees that people grow either for commercial purposes or for just home consumption, sharing with friends and so forth. And then I went on to study different types of agroforestry systems. such as windbreaks and alley cropping and contour hedgerows and all of those kinds of agroforestry systems. And now what I've come to is something that is becoming more and more of a important way of thinking about agroforestry as a regenerative practice. So I'm going to talk a lot about how we can make agroforestry regenerative, and I'll tell you what regenerative means as we go along here. But also traveling around the Pacific through the years, I've had the great privilege of visiting some traditional indigenous agroforestry systems that have been around for thousands of years. So what I found is that those are incredibly useful models for designing our own agroforestry systems if we want to move in that direction. So this is a Samoan agroforest, which is a wonderful example. It's got breadfruit in it, as you can see in the middle of the photo, but it also has banana, cacao, coconut, timber trees, and medicinal plants. So I'm also going to be using this example as we move along. I also want to acknowledge the people who practice agroforestry as part of their culture, as part of their indigenous ways, and in order to care for the environment. And those are the indigenous people of the Pacific who, again, have shared with me and share freely what they know, but they're not very outspoken normally. So this is just a few people who I've had the chance to speak with and learn from. Some of them, such as Camilo Faliofa in the bottom right, who was my neighbor for 15 years, or Keiki Kekipi, who's in the middle of the photo, and some who have just allowed me to step on their farm and ask them questions and so forth. These are really the agroforestry masters. Where you learn agroforestry, I found over the years, is as a child working in the fields with others who have been doing it for generations. It's that intergenerational knowledge, which is so important for agroforestry, because agroforestry is really knowledge intensive and skills intensive, and it requires observing what's going on in nature and interacting in real time. So making decisions not based on our calendars or any predetermined schedule, but on what nature is saying through what's going on. And so observation is so important, and we learn that as children. And the girl here in the photo, she's holding a cacao pod and a machete in the other hand. She knows more about agroforestry than I do. And really, it's people like her who should be teaching this. And that's what I'm working on more and more these days, is engaging people who really know agroforestry from childhood, and putting them at the center of the teaching. That I think is very important right now. Okay, so you probably know that before Western contact, Hawaii was a very rich and abundant, had very rich and abundant agriculture, and it's documented by those who came. This is a quote from Archibald Menzies, and in his writings, and which he took copious notes of his travels, he documented how incredibly abundant and well kept the Hawaiian agroforests were. And so there's no doubt that the Hawaiian systems were as abundant or more abundant than any remaining agroforestry systems in the Pacific, such as the Samoan ones. An example would be the Kalu'ulu, which is the breadfruit agroforest in Kona, near where I live right here, which was about 18 miles long and about a half mile wide. It's depicted roughly in yellow here on this Google image. And that belt, that forest, agroforest of breadfruit, produced 40 to 80 million pounds of breadfruit per year. And that was just one of many breadfruit agroforests that existed pre-contact. To give you an idea of what 40 to 80 million pounds is, that's approximately the same amount of white potato that Hawaii imports annually. So this one breadfruit agroforest could supply all of our potato needs, because anything you can do with potato, you can do with breadfruit, and even better. So, and breadfruit was not alone in that system. There was sugarcane, banana, taro, and many other crops. So the breadfruit yield is only part of the yield, a small part of the yield of that agroforest. In a very telling passage also by Archibald Menzies, he notes here that the only thing wanting is to render the Hawaiians useful to themselves and mankind by putting them into plantation agriculture. So that's the next thing that happened. The agroforests were cut down to a large extent in various regions, and sugarcane was planted. You could call sugarcane the killer app of monoculture plantation agriculture. And this picture is of the last remaining sugarcane fields on Maui before they disappeared a few years ago. And so when plantation agriculture came, of course, things changed very radically in terms of food and nutrition security, because people no longer had access to their rich and abundant agroforest plantings. Local food production started disappearing and replaced by imports. We lost our resilience to economic and environmental disasters because of dependency on outside food, and the traditional knowledge began to disappear as well. So that's the legacy that we're addressing now. And a very extreme example of that would be Lanai Island. This is Lanai Island, which was at one time a green island with people living all around, growing all of their own food. And there were year-round flowing streams on this island. And in the early 1900s, sugar was planted on the wet side of Lanai Island, which is in the upper upper right-hand part of the island. Sugarcane was planted, and that eventually went away. And then pineapple was planted. That eventually went away. And what was left is essentially a windswept, almost desert island with virtually all the reefs silted in by soil that washed out of the plantation fields. So this is the story. This is not just Lanai. All of our islands have gone in this direction, and Lanai is just an extreme example. But this has also taken place all over the world. So what we're dealing with all over the world is the legacy of this monoculture plantation type agriculture, leaving degradation behind in terms of soil and watershed, biodiversity, and so many other things. So a lot of people don't know that Archibald Menzies is still alive. And this is a little quote from him. And he's changed his tune a little bit. The only thing wanting is to render myself beneficial to the planet. My bad. That's my attempt at humor, folks. Oh, and by the way, you can see what crop he's growing now. So it's interesting to me, over the course of my 30 years of working in agroforestry, that the awareness of the problems brought about by the last 150 years of agriculture has changed priorities quite a bit. So from export economy and just growing crops for export and generating profits, the new priorities which exist all around the Pacific are included in this, roughly included in this diagram here, where you can see that local food has become a priority everywhere. Growing local food for local consumption, and also feeding into the local economy. So instead of exporting money and bringing in food, cycling that money through the local economy. Food security has become more and more an issue for people, and very much in the awareness of many island nations that have experienced hurricanes in the last 10 years. I don't know if you know, but the Commonwealth of the Northern Marianas experienced the first Category 6 typhoon a couple of years ago with winds over 200 miles an hour. They're all about food security now, because after a typhoon, you want to have as much food as you can locally grown and not be dependent on imports. Community well-being, resilience to economic disturbances, and with the pandemic, this has become also a big issue, just resilience to disturbances in global trade and global food distribution. And of course, nutrition and health. So in 2019, which is probably the busiest year I've had um, holding workshops throughout the Pacific, I traveled with Auntie Shirley Kauhaihau, who's in many of these photos here, who did breadfruit. She taught about breadfruit. I taught about agroforestry. We did 18 workshops around the Pacific. This is just a few of them, and with tremendous interest from everywhere. So let's talk a little bit about what models we have that we can draw from. I'm not suggesting that we go back to, or that we even could go back to, the agroforests that were once existing throughout Hawaii. Time doesn't go backwards. We're moving forwards. Conditions have changed. Our priorities have changed to some extent. Our culture has changed. And so these are models for how things can work, not only sustainably, but regeneratively over generations. And we can draw from them and learn from them. And I'm going to show you one way of that we've drawn from these examples to design agroforestry systems. So this is Upolu Island. You can see the stark contrast between this and Lanai Island. This is still an all green island with people growing food all around. And there's plenty of food for everyone. And the reefs and ocean are still healthy because they have not allowed the kind of erosive agricultural systems that cause so much erosion, have caused so much erosion here. This is an agroforest in Apia, which is the capital of Samoa. And this is from the lanai of an Airbnb where Auntie Shirley and I stayed for a workshop. And this is a very common sight, and still in a city such as Apia, there's food forests everywhere. There's it's just the common way people manage the land around villages and various developments. So what you can see in this photo is lots of breadfruit. There's banana, there's coconut, there's papaya. What might not be so recognizable is there's a timber tree here, which is called pomuli. And everybody in Samoa grows pomuli because that is the timber they use for the posts for their hale. So they build with those posts, and so they grow their timber. There's also medicinal plants and craft plants and all kinds of things going on in this agroforest. But what you don't see is the people, because there are people here. You can hear them much of the time. They're out harvesting, children playing, children working. And so there's a lot of connection between these landscapes and human beings, which is a very important part of agroforestry, that connection and which goes hand in hand with the observation. So what do we need to do today? And what do we need to do next week? And when will the ulu be ready to harvest? Those questions are all answered by this day-to-day connection with the food system. And if everybody has an agroforest like that in their backyard, then the entire landscape is one giant agroforest. This is also Apia, so near the same area where I just took that photo from. And so you have a healthy ecosystem. Um, when it rains, the water's captured in the soil. So you hold on to the water, you have very, very low erosion, and you're also holding on to water so that things don't dry out as quickly during dry periods. And so it's like a big sponge. So essentially the agriculture is also a watershed. It's also a biodiversity bank. There's so many different species that are cultivated. They attract many different um, other species such as birds and insects and other types of animals, and underground as well is extremely biodiverse in the soils. So this is as close to a natural biodiverse forest as you can get. And so we're kind of emulating and creating an analog to a natural forest, which we know is a very healthy environment and is very resilient to extremes of weather, um, of um, all kinds of extremes that could happen, wind, too much water, too little water, etc. This is another example. This is in Chuuk, which is part of Federated States of Micronesia. I don't know if you can see on your screens, but Chuuk is the epicenter of breadfruit biodiversity in the world. And their mountainside, their hillside, their agricultural areas are full of breadfruit. And so most of what you see in this picture is breadfruit trees, many different varieties, intercropped with other species such as coconut. And this might be what the Kalu'ulu here in Kona looked like from a distance at one time, a big breadfruit agroforest. Here's another example, and I'm showing you these because I want you to see the similarities. These are different island nations that are spread apart by thousands of miles south of the equator, north of the equator, and yet the patterns that of planting and the species to some extent are all the same. So this is Guam. This is a home garden in Guam. You can look at it and it would look very much like Samoa. There is one thing you probably wouldn't see much of in Samoa, and that's on the right-hand side of this photo, and that's betel nut, because that is an important crop for people in Guam. So they grow betel nut in their systems. But overall, the system is very similar in its planting pattern, its density, it's the diversity of crops to all of these other ones that I'm showing you. Here's another one. This is Saipan. This is actually close to Guam. the Commonwealth of the Northern Mariana Islands. This is a little bit more open agroforest where you see a lot of beetle nut, but you also see the banana and you see understory crops. You see papayas coming up, you see cocoa yam and other food crops. There's also chili peppers, which they grow a lot of there. And finally, here's an example from Yap. If you ever have a chance to go to Yap, that is another place that is very original. They've managed to keep their agriculture and their culture very intact from ancient times. And so again, we have a multi-story biodiverse agroforest with lots of food and medicine growing. This system's been around for about 3,000 years in Yap. Oh, and here's one more. This is a very young agroforest. You can see there's cassava growing, there's banana, there's an ulu tree, the leaves of which you can see just on the right-hand side. There's sweet potato where I'm standing to take this photo. You can see it in the lower left corner, sweet potato. This is a very young agroforest. And this could be anywhere. And the reason I show this is that this is a Ponapean on Maui who's growing exactly the kind of agroforest he would be growing in his native land, Ponape. So the question that has been intriguing me for the last few years is, how can we regenerate these agroforests? And I'm going to introduce Caitlyn in a moment. How we can regenerate these agroforests? Why do people think that they're so important that they would keep them for 3,000 years? And what is behind the kind of the operating system of why people grow agroforests? And that would help me at least understand how we can bring back these very, very productive systems. And so I just want to introduce Caitlyn. She's, as I said, she's been studying here for a few weeks, agroforestry, and she was previously a Peace Corps volunteer in Fiji, so she's very familiar with our tropical environments and the kind of the plantation legacy that many of our islands have experienced. And so I just wanted her to have an opportunity to share with you briefly what she's been working on.
Okay. All right.
Unmute.
Perfect. Okay. Hi, and thank you. I first became interested.
Sorry. That's my bad.
I first became interested in agroforestry through the breadfruit tree. As Craig mentioned, I was a Peace Corps volunteer in Fiji. And when I was there, I was working on different income generation projects with women's groups and youth groups. And one of the biggest income generation projects for the women's groups was baking, selling baked goods at roadside stalls and bus stands and et cetera. The government agency I was with, we would offer baking trainings and certificates to the women to help them with this project. Baking and baked goods have a huge influence. You know, every function you're at or event or even just tea time, you're just surrounded by plates of baked goods. Baked goods have such a role that Fiji imports $1 million US of wheat flour every year to kind of supplement the use of all of this baking. And so as I was sitting around all of these plates of these baked goods, and I'm with the families and the children, and I'm watching them consume this, and I start to slowly recognize the different health issues that's facing Fiji, malnutrition in the kids, high diabetes rates. And I'm watching as most of the meals consumed are just wheat or sugar. And I start to wonder, is there an alternative to this usage of wheat? And I start looking into alternative wheat flours, and I come across the breadfruit tree. And the breadfruit tree is gaining recognition as the future of food security in the South Pacific. It's high in vitamins, it's low glycemic index, which means it's gluten-free. The tree itself is incredibly resilient to the climate change. You know, after the hurricanes and the cyclones, when we would step outside the next day, there's the breadfruit tree standing tall. So I start really getting this interest in breadfruit, and in particular breadfruit flour. And is this something that can be used instead of wheat flour? Is it something that can be made at a community level? So we don't have to rely on the imports. And I start doing a little more research into it. And as I become more aware of breadfruit, I start observing just how many trees are in Fiji. All of the outreaches I go on, the villages I visit, the communities I stay in, I notice there's so many breadfruit trees. But underneath all of those breadfruit trees is rotting breadfruit. And the image of the rotting breadfruit, it made me really sad, because I realized just how much of an influence Western diet has on the Fijian diet. My own culture's influence on the Fijian diet. There's this transition away from traditional food staples like breadfruit. People are now eating imported, highly refined foods, and it's affecting the health. 70% of Fijians die from diabetes today because of this transition away from their local foods. And so I become even more motivated to find a model for breadfruit flour production. You know, this is it's gonna help the health of the community and of the land after witnessing the cyclones and realizing the importance of the food security. I'm interested. I'm like, breadfruit flour, this is it. But the more I research, the more I realize that the Western market is really tapping into breadfruit. They see it for gluten-free, and it's a big niche market, big profits. And because of that, the breadfruit tree is becoming exploited. It's being turned into a cash crop. It's fitting into monocultures. It's everything that it's not to be. And I recognize the importance of profit, absolutely, because my motivation for this started with helping the livelihoods of the women. How can they keep with their baked goods? How can they keep generating income? But how can they do it in a manner that is healthier for them and their families? So profit is very important. I recognize that, but it's more than profit. And so for me, that's kind of what agroforestry represents. The importance of agroforestry, it goes beyond preserving biodiversity. It goes beyond the solution to monoculture. It's also preserving cultural diversity. With agroforestry and with food is a marker of identity. And so when we're looking at what we're planting and we're looking at these crops in this system, we need to pay homage and honor to the culture and the tradition that is behind these foods. Like I said, profit is important, but also the families of those Fijian women are important. The land that they live on is important. The land that has hosted them and their families and their ancestors and generations to come, and the future generations, it's all so important. And so what I've been looking into while I'm here studying is just really the value system of agroforestry, and the resilience of not just the land and not just the biodiversity, but the resilience of the culture and the knowledge that comes with that. And just how do we honor and respect the land that we're on, the land that we're growing on, the communities who inhabit this land and have before we have even started growing, and how do we just respect and honor the food that we're planting and recognize the importance of preserving this food so that the Western diet does not influence any other diet, so that these diseases do not continue. Yeah, so thank you for allowing me to share.
All right. Thank you so much, Caitlin. So I'm going to go on a little bit. I understand we have a break at 10, so I'll go to just before 10. Is that right, Kalani?
Yep, perfect.
Okay. So let me share my screen again. Caitlin mentioned that people who are thinking about breadfruit now, many people for commercial gain, which is something that we all want to have happen, have also perhaps lost the connection with many things about breadfruit itself. And I myself was shocked. I've worked since 2010 on revitalizing breadfruit because it is the quintessential agroforestry crop. We always talk about agroforestry and the culture of breadfruit first, knowing full well that if we put breadfruit into monocultures, just like any other monoculture, there's going to be lots of problems. And so, but we've seen a lot of monocultures planted. And this is just one example on Oahu, which in my naivete, I didn't expect would happen. And I'm going to hopefully convince you that it's much better, not only for the land, but for the farmer and commercial profit to do this in agroforestry versus a monoculture. But I just want to reinforce, because we're so used to seeing this, it almost doesn't register what the effects of this type of monoculture are. I mentioned erosion before. So when you have clear culture like this, with just the crop growing and no ground cover, you lose a lot of soil and water. Every time there's a heavy rain, there's a loss of soil and water. And Bill Mollison, who's the permaculture guru, always says the value of the crops is less than the value of replacing the soil and water that's lost over time. So the soil life is degraded through erosion, but also by virtue of having the sun directly on the soil, the temperature goes up and you lose a lot of soil life, which is very beneficial to the breadfruit. The mycorrhizae like it a lot cooler than a sun-baked soil. So you lose your mycorrhizae, which are the super connector of natural ecosystems, and all of the soil life that goes with that. So you lose a lot of soil life. You also lose water and organic matter to the air. So there's evaporation of water from the soil, and there's loss of organic matter. As it breaks down, it is lost to the environment rather than being cycled within the soil. The way we survive this, and the way plantations have survived this type of culture for so long, is by adding inputs. So we buy the fertilizer to replace the nutrients that are washed away. And we buy the water for irrigation. And then we buy chemicals, perhaps, to handle the diseases that crop up in our plants. So we do this, and then we use a lot of inputs to keep it from collapsing. If you compare that, which breadfruit's just one example of monoculture, there's so many others that we could go into, but I'm not going to today. We can see that in terms of capturing water and nutrients, building soil, optimizing productivity, developing resilience to pests and diseases, mitigating economic and environmental stressors, and food security, monocultures address none of those issues. Whereas multi-story or biodiverse agroforestry addresses all of those issues. So that's why we can look to this example to heal our agricultural areas and regenerate productivity. Our old concept for, my entire career, we've been talking about sustainability. We need sustainability. Well, that's good, but sustainability really just means maintaining the status that we've got and not getting worse. And that's got to be our old concept now. That is no longer valid, because there's so many areas that are degraded in so many ways, from land to ocean, from shore to mountain, through activities of either agriculture or pasture, that everything we do now has to be regenerative. It has to be better every year, not just the same. We need to improve conditions continually. Nature does that all the time. And we see that on Hawaii Island, on the lava fields. If you look at young lava fields, they're continually getting more biodiverse. There's always more, bigger and more vibrant forest. So nature's always moving towards regeneration. We just have to use that and work in harmony with that in our agriculture. So let me just show you something, possibly in a new way that you've seen so many times, I'm sure, in your life, and that is what nature does after we disturb an area. This is a little area. It's very small. It's probably about 15 feet across. This happens to be a botanical garden on Kauai. It's a patch of area that keeps getting cleared. And you can see what nature does here. And these principles we can use, and in fact, people have used for thousands of years to create this cycle of regeneration. And so what you see here is, first of all, nature always comes back very densely. There's a high density of plants here that emerged spontaneously. So density is important. Second of all, what you see here is high diversity of species. So there's about 15 different species growing here, again, spontaneously. So we have everything from nitrogen fixers such as Crotalaria. We've got the castor bean on the left-hand side. There's Lucena, another nitrogen fixer. There's several things in the mint family. And there's amaranth, and a bunch of different weeds and grasses coming up, broadleaf and grasses. So what also is going on here is that some of these plants emerge very quickly and they go away quickly. And some of these plants emerge slowly and they stay for a long time. And so what I'm going to show you in our design examples is how to do that in our cropping systems, to actually plant together short-term, medium-term, and long-term crops so that they work beautifully together over time. This is just another picture of that little patch. You can see it a little bit better here. Okay, so now what I'm going to show you is one of my friends and colleagues and teachers, Kalani Souza's, one of his agroforests. This is in Pauilo, in Hamakua. This is the beginnings of a newly planted little home food forest, agroforest. And what you see is the exact same principles. There's high density of plants, there's high diversity of different plants, and there's short, medium, and long-term crops planted all together at the same time. This is exactly the way nature does it. And so what you see here is There's vegetables in here like lettuces and different choys and things like that. There's chili peppers, there's sweet potato. You can see the tea leaf. There's papayas and bananas that have been planted. There's pigeon peas. There's perennial leaf vegetables, which hopefully we'll have time to talk about. They're all planted here together in what looks like chaos, but it's actually nature's preferred chaos. And this works incredibly well if you do it right. So this is after about a month, and this is 6 months later, the same patch. It's about 35 feet in diameter. And you can see all the vegetables have essentially been lived out their lives and they've been harvested and eaten. And what you have here is the perennials. So there's, well, there are still some shorter term things, such as there's cassava. I forgot to mention cassava is planted in this. So there's cassava on the edge here. You can see the papayas. There's chaya, the perennial leaf vegetable. There's a lot of pigeon pea and bananas, and there's fruit trees growing underneath this food forest. And this is about 9 months old. You can see it's always changing. It's always developing. Things are being either consumed or pruned and mulched or just cycled out because they've lived out their lives. So that's an example of a home agroforest that is very much like what Pacific Islanders have done for a long, long time. This is another example. We did this in 2019. This is a plot at the Waimanalo Learning Center, which is at the Ag Experiment Station. You might have been there. This is within the organically managed corner of the experiment station. And so we, or I should say they, the staff there prepared this field, this beautiful field. They laid out irrigation. They actually added compost, and they augured out the main holes for the fruit trees. And so essentially they prepared the site beautifully after so they've disturbed the site, prepared it for planting, and then we planted very densely. So we had a field day, a work day, lots of people. And this is what it looked like 2 months later. So it's hard to see. Again, it looks chaotic. There's lots of different fruit trees in there. In the front, you'll see a cassava plant, and there's a mango also in the center of the picture in the front. And then behind the cassava on the left, towards the left, you see taro leaves. And we also have, you can also see Pacific spinach, which is the big shiny leaves. And there's also lemongrass, there's ava planted, and also perennial vegetables, all in that one row. One of the characteristics of these plantings is it's hard to see what's there because a lot of it is slow and will take over when the short-term stuff goes away. So here's another picture of that field. All right, so now let me just look at the time here. I have 10 minutes before the break. So I'm going to talk about regenerative agroforestry. And I was very honored to be invited by Patagonia to do a project with the Breadfruit Institute about regenerative agroforestry. And so this was a great opportunity for me to take stock of what I'd learned for about 30 years and put it into this framework of regenerative thinking. And it really helped me understand what's going on here. It's hard to explain to a person how to plant this Samoan agroforest. I think you just learn it by doing it. So what we ended up doing was coming up with the the outcomes that we wanted from our agroforestry system, which are these regenerative outcomes, and then looking at what measurable characteristics in our agroforests give us these outcomes. So how can we plant the agroforest so that we get these outcomes? Regenerative agriculture is the new wave in organic agriculture, if you will, throughout the world. So these are the principles. These 5 principles are commonly cited as being those 4 regenerative targets for regenerative agriculture. The first one, of course, is building soil. So we want to continually build soil in terms of not just nutrient availability, but biodiversity of the soil food web, soil structure, soil organic matter, all of those things. So we want to build our soil. Number 2 is we want to increase water retention. When it rains, we want to hold on to that water. We don't want it to just run away. And that's what watershed does. And that's why all Hawaiian mountains were covered with springs, because the mountains and the watershed held onto the water and let it go slowly rather than having it rush down to the ocean. So we want to hold on to our water. Number 3 is increased biodiversity. Biodiversity gives us resilience in our systems, so it's very important. Number 4 is ecosystem health, and loosely what that means is the ability of the ecosystem itself, the larger ecosystem, to renew itself, to heal itself, and to regenerate itself. And finally, hold on to carbon, so sequester carbon. Take carbon out of the atmosphere and put it into our agricultural living and dying organic matter, as well as soil. These are the 5 outcomes that we want. And so we wrote a paper. If you just look up Elovich, Mazzaroli, and Rigoni 2018, it's an open access paper about regenerative agroforestry. We came up with 4 principles. If you follow these 4 principles of regeneration, you will get those outcomes that I just talked about. You follow them to a certain standard. So the paper that we wrote offers a standard for a measurable standard for meeting these principles. So the first principle is simply just integration of trees, shrubs, and other woody perennials. That integration of the perennials is very important because it builds channels. For one thing, it builds channels into the soil, which allow water to percolate and increase water retention, which is not done by grasses and other herbaceous plants. So the presence of them is very important for water retention and all of the other outcomes that we want. We want a certain density of those perennials per unit area. So we want just one tree in a big open field is not enough. We need a certain density. And so we suggest, based on our research, what that density should be at a minimum of woody perennials. The next thing we would like is diversity in our species. So we want diversity in terms of plant families, different species, and also leaf size, structure of the trees and shrubs. We want a lot of diversity in our species. And finally, we really want several stories. We want different layers of the forest, the agroforest, which allow us to capture more light. Capturing light is really, you could think about our whole job as optimizing our capture of light energy. We're capturing light through photosynthesis, into organic matter. The more organic matter, the more everything grows, the healthier our ecosystem will be. So if we have layers of different perennials and also the ground layer, then we're capturing light as that light passes through the different layers. And we're actually creating much more total biomass, much more total organic matter than any single layer of plants would do. So in our system, we use a color coding of these canopy layers. And we've broken them down into essentially 5 layers. From the top, the blue layer's the emergent layer. If you look at a natural forest, there's a few plants, a few trees, palms that stick out above everybody else. Those are the emergent ones. They are the towering koa trees, the coconut trees, the lolu palms. They're the ones who rise up above everybody else. Then there's the high layer. That would be the things that need a lot of light in their natural environment. They love a lot of light, but they can tolerate, let's say, 20% shade. And so that would be things like breadfruit, mangoes, lychee, lots of the fruit tree crops, fruit and nuts that we like to grow are in the high category. Then there's the mediums. They can take more shade. Those will take up to 40% shade. So that would be things like citrus and soursop and the things that can take more shade, and they'll do fine. And finally, we have the lows. The lows are the ones that can take the most shade. That would be things like coffee. Coffee is a forest plant. It grows in shade. And black pepper and vanilla and different culinary herbs in the ginger family, and lots of things like that will grow in the low stratum. And finally, you have the ground cover. So just to break down back to the Samoan Agroforest, and we'll take a break in a minute. Actually, so why don't we take a break now, and then I'll continue with this after the break.
That sounds great. Thanks so much, Craig. This has been really enlightening. So we'll come back around 10:10.
Can somebody say how long the break is?
Typically we take 10 minutes, but we could do 5. Do you have a preference?
That's good, sweet love.
All right, I think we're gonna start back up in a minute here. So whenever you're comfortable and ready, everyone else just kind of reconnect and get ready. Thank you.
This is just like how my education was. I'm so used to it.
So are we ready to go?
Ready. Take it away.
Okay, great. All right, so I'm just going to finish up on the regenerative agroforestry principles that we use for the design. Then we're going to go out in the field. We're going to attempt to live stream from an agroforest. And then we'll come back and I'll show you the design tool that we developed. So back to this. So I was saying that we can use these indigenous systems as models. So I'm just refreshing your memory about the Samoan one. And so here's the Samoan one again, but I've overlaid our different colored canopy blobs over that system. And so you can see the blue is the emergent. That's the ones that are widely spaced and stick up over everybody else. That's the coconut and the pomuli that I mentioned before. That's the timber tree that they build their hale with. Below that, we have breadfruit. So breadfruit is the high in this system, the green. Below the breadfruit, we have the yellows, the medium story, which is cacao and banana, which are grown in the medium layer of agroforests throughout their native range or their original ranges in America, Central and South America. So here we have, especially cacao, a crop that has been adopted for 150 years into agroforestry in its perfect place and its perfect layer in the agroforest. And finally, we have in the low spot, noni and kava or ava. So now we're getting somewhere because now we can start discerning the different layers of this agroforest and start maybe developing our design process. So we have the beginnings of a design, but as I said before, it's very hard to describe how that was planted, and I don't think I could do it or do it justice. Even though I planted systems like that myself, it's hard to describe. So we want it to be a little bit more systematic. So let's break it down a little bit further. Let's look at a 10-year-old agroforest like the Samoan one and this is the example with the Samoan crops. We have a side view and an overhead view. And again, the blue, green, yellow, and red circles are the different layers. And you can see from both views, but especially from the overhead view, that the canopies overlap each other and that the ground is completely covered. So we have this sense that in 10 years, we're good. The canopies are layered and it looks, the way it should. Okay, let's look at today, if we were to plant that agroforest, how the field would look. So let's rewind in time from 10 years to today. We're going to plant that agroforest. And these are what we call the long-term plants. These are the ones that are going to be there for a long time, decades or centuries in some cases. This is the positions of those plants from that previous drawing. I'll go back to the previous drawing. And then we go here. That is the positions. And you can notice now, especially in the overhead view, there's a lot of open space. A lot of people do this kind of thing, thinking that they're doing agroforestry, and they're correct, they are doing agroforestry, but they wind up getting very frustrated because they have a lot of open space between their long-term crops to take care of. And this is an example. I'm not being critical of this, except to say that this is what a lot of people do. And they plant out a spaced out but diverse orchard of long-term crops. And this ends up frustrating people a great deal because now you've got an even higher maintenance burden because it's usually planted more densely than even a monoculture would be. And so you've got to take care of all the grass, all the different weeds, etc. And in this case, you can see this is a hamakua planting. So they had to build wind shelters for each plant. So there's no intermediate plants in there to protect the crops that need the protection. And so we have quite a frustrating and expensive way to establish an agroforest. It's expensive because all you're doing is working for the first few years and you're not getting anything back. And it turns out your work is not that valuable because you're not optimizing your photosynthesis. You don't have different layers of things. So you're not optimizing your capture of sunlight and you're not optimizing your organic matter accumulation. So this is, better than a monoculture, but I would say we can do a lot better than this. Okay, so let's look at our map again, our little tiny plot here. And you can see the long-term plants in the upper diagram, and in the lower diagram, we have our medium-term plants. They are circles of the same color scheme, but the circles are dashed. So those are medium-term. And by medium-term, we mean, and me and my colleagues who work on this, up to about 4 years of age, these will last in the system. So the medium-term plants include things like papayas, pineapples, different types of taro, long-term species of taro, chili peppers, things like that. So now we have our medium-term plants, which I've laid out here an example, and you put them together. And if you overlay the medium term onto the long term, which for some reason I didn't bring a diagram of that with me in this PowerPoint, you can see that the overlay of those two will fill the space very quickly. What I haven't shown here is the short-term plants. And somebody asked a question about where the short-term plants go once your longer-term plants take over. And the answer to that is, it depends on how you manage your system. It depends on how you planned your system. You can plan openings to have short-term crops always present, or you can plant a new area with your short and medium and long-term plants and just keep planting. We call that planting the wave. So you move across the landscape, planting new areas, and you always have an area with short-term plants growing. And you just keep going around and around until you come back to where you started, you cut that down and you start all over again. Or you just keep planting into your neighbor's yard. That's another way to do it. So the question is, how can we be more systematic about our design and planning? This illustrates on the left the Samoan Agroforest from above, with the coconuts, the pomuli, the timber tree, the breadfruit, and all the other things. And on the right is a more systematic arrangement of those crops. The right-hand drawing has the same number of each of the crops as the left-hand drawing. It's just that they're arranged a little bit more efficiently for our planning and management of them. But we've retained the same principles of diversity and density and everything. So let me see here. Okay, so let's go out in the field. I'm going to attempt this. If we have technical problems, we'll just come back here. But I'm going to show you a couple of our fields that we planted in the way that I've just described. And when we come back, I'll show you the design tool. So Caitlyn's going to help me. We're going to walk out here. This is one of our agroforests right here that was planted in about mid-December. And this photo was taken about a month ago. Right now, I'm going to go into that area, and it's going to be hard to see anything. It's so grown at this point. So what I have to do, I believe, I have to stop my screen sharing, don't I? Let's stop the video on that one. Okay.
Right, I think you're muted.
Okay. I see somebody put a question in the chat. That's great. If you could just do that as questions come up and we can look at them. So we're walking through some areas here. I'm going to get up to the agroforest that I just showed you in the picture. This is the agroforest that I just showed you in the picture. Let's see. Okay. We're going to come back here in a moment. What we're going to start with is this area here, which we just planted. Actually, Caitlyn planted this about, would you say a month ago?
Yeah.
About a month ago. Okay. But before we look at this, let me just show you what this area looked like before we planted it. So if you look back here, this is just a fallow area with lots of trees that grew here spontaneously over the last 15 years. This is what the area we planted that I'm just about to show you looked like when Caitlyn got here and then chopped it down. You chopped it down, right?
Yes.
And what this is, you might think, oh gosh, what a mess. That's a jungle there, and you why didn't you just clear it with a bulldozer and push it aside? Or you might think, oh, what a shame, what a shame. It's a productive area and it's fallow and there's lots of birds who live here. Why did you cut it down? Well, what we're doing here is something that people have done for thousands of years, which is we're taking advantage of nature's accumulation of organic matter, and we're returning that to the soil, and we're starting a new wave of vigorous growth. And so this would be called slash and mulch, or some term such as that. And I have pictures of this from places around the Pacific, but what we did was we availed ourselves of nature's accumulation of organic matter. And then we started a whole new planting. And so I'll go back here. And as you can see, we kept all of the wood. This wood is our carbon bank to feed the mycorrhizae in particular over a number of years. It also affords us a nice pathway system where we're not compacting the ground, and it also is great durable mulch. And so, and then all of the rest of the organic matter is in the beds between the pathways. So you can see these beds are mulched heavily. And so we put all the green stuff in there. We put all the little branches, all the smaller branches went into those beds. So once we did that, this area was ready to plant. And in fact, as soon as you open up an area like this, as you know, nature is going to plant it if you don't. So I would recommend, if you're going to open up an area like this, to be ready to plant immediately when you're done clearing and preparing the area. So, and I don't know if you can see our flags, but we flagged this out. We did a design and we flagged this out with our blue, green, yellow, and red flags to indicate our long-term species. So all of the long-term species have been planted here. And those include different fruit trees. We have white sapote, we have loquat, we have cacao, we have abiu, rollinia, and a couple others. We have a couple of gardenias, and there's green sapote. Are you hearing me okay?
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
Okay. To hold the camera clear, we can see a little bit more detail of like the flags, but the quality's been really great so far. Thank you.
Okay, great. So I'll try to hold the camera still. Those flags represent those long-term species that will be here for a long, long time. Now, most of what you actually can see here is not the long-term stuff, because the long-term stuff is generally very slow to start and won't really take off for a year or 2 or 3 years in many cases. And so, for example, we planted lolu palms. This is the lolu that's native to the region. Those will be in here for decades, and they will overtop everybody. They're an emergent. But what you see here that is green, most of what you see here that is green is our short-term stuff. So what we have for short-term stuff is cowpeas, which is a type of a long bean. We have daikon, radishes, and we have we have turnips and a bunch of other short-term vegetables which are lining our pathways. We also have a bunch of medium-term stuff. So we have the pineapples, which you can see here. We have papayas scattered throughout, and we have a lot of pigeon peas scattered throughout. We also have sugarcane. That's another what we call medium term. So we have sugarcane planted in here. So when you do this, you start igniting the turbocharged engine of natural regeneration. This is where we're tapping into nature's own ability to synergize between different crops in a successional way, so that we're going to get within a few weeks, we'll have our first crop. And once those vegetables are gone, we will have in a few months, oh, there's also taro planted throughout here. I forgot to mention that. So in a few months, we'll have taro, we'll start getting papayas, our bananas will start setting fruit. And so we'll have a continuous coverage as well as continuous production over time. Okay, let's leave this area. So that was a month old. This was planted the same way, mid-December. So what does that put us at? January, February, March. So 4.5 months. So this might be really hard to see, but I'm gonna try to show it to you. We still have in this area all of our long-term crops, which include a bunch of different fruit trees, including right here, we have a Tahitian, this is a Tahitian lychee.
The video just dropped off.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
That's because somebody just tried to call me on my phone. So so we have all of our long-term crops. We have a bunch of citrus. We have egg fruit. We have star fruit, a whole bunch of a variety of long-term crops. But what mainly you see here now is the medium-term things. You can see the papayas are coming up really well. We have this, which I like to use a lot. This is a tree basil. We have pigeon peas coming up everywhere. And if you look down here again is the bele. So this is the Pacific spinach. This, I think Kalani might be talking about perennial vegetables. Perennial vegetables are a wonderful addition to an agroforest because most of them are planted from cuttings, so they're very cheap and abundant to plant, and they come up quickly, and they also can occupy different strata as the agroforest grows. And what I mean by that is the Pacific spinach can be in full sun, medium sun, or even low light and perform well. So we use a lot of Pacific spinach, very nutritious, and super easy to use in many dishes. So you can see, let me move around here. We planted a lot of tea leaf. I'd say there's probably 200 tea leaf in here. And you can see, here's an example of tea leaf. We plant them all from very short cuttings, which is very cheap and easy. We have tree tomato. Tree tomato is another medium term. This thing, I don't know if you guys recognize it. This was kind of a surprise to me. This is lulo, which is also in the tomato family. It produces a sweet tart fruit that people make into juice. And we have several of those. There's another one here. You can see the size of it. This is over 6 feet tall, and 4.5 months ago it was about 8 inches tall. Here's a long gone tree. The long gone tree is surrounded. We have taro. We have some vegetables. These are chili peppers that we grew, all in this bed. We're getting tons of chili peppers out of this. And I'll just show you a little bit more, and then we'll go back to the classroom. So here's another, this is another medium term. This is a Tongan variety of Apia, which is alocasia, related to, taro, but a much bigger animal. I just saw a question pop up on the screen. Is there weeding involved? Almost zero weeding. We don't really have weeds. We mulched everything and then we planted it so densely, there's no room for weeds. The other thing I forgot to mention, actually, I should mention this. So we have a lot of trees growing in here. Here's a view. These are all nitrogen fixing trees, because you've got to keep feeding the system with organic matter. If you don't feed the system with organic matter, it's going to go downhill rather rapidly. So we have about half of the area is occupied by nitrogen fixers. And so instead of weeding, our job is coming through and mulching in a strategic way when the time is right. So we do cutting and mulching when the time is right. And that's how we keep everybody happy and healthy. Here's another one I like to use in our designs. This is something most people don't need to plant, but it's educational. This is cotton. So this is a tree cotton. Most people don't know that cotton was grown commercially in Kona at one point. And they also don't know that cotton is the most sprayed crop in the world. I believe cotton consumes about 30% of all agricultural pesticides or something of that nature. So we can grow cotton with no pesticides in systems like this and get actual cotton from it. I've never used a single bag of fertilizer on my farm. There's no fertilizer, no minerals, no outside inputs have been used here ever. So it's all natural regeneration from nature's own engine. If you can imagine, the Hawaiians had abundant systems. They never used any outside fertilizers. They just tapped into nature's own way of doing things. And you might wonder, what about pests? Where are you, Caitlin?
I'm right here.
You want to comment on pests?
The lack of pests.
What did you tell me the other day?
That I not realized until recently when we were talking about pests, I had not seen any coming from farms where we're littered with aphids and grasshoppers. It was really refreshing to be somewhere where you're not worrying about pests as you're working.
Yeah, so in general, there are very, very few pest problems here. And if a plant does experience pest problems, there's so many different things planted. A lot of times I would just let that particular plant go because if nature is attacking it, then I'm not going to fight that. So we give nature lots of options. We have eggplants here. They've been producing. Okay. I'm going to walk back and I'm going to read your chat questions as I walk back. if I can manage to do that. There's 26 questions and comments in the chat. Oh my goodness. Oh, these are. Yeah.
Craig, if you want, we can read you the questions.
Yeah, Kirk, I'm not sure if you can hear us. I think the bandwidth might have dropped off.
Maybe let's give him a couple of minutes to get back and set up, and if he prefers, we can read him the questions.
Okay. Great. Well, it seems like that worked okay. I've got to hold the camera more still. I should have just had a gimbal. Okay. Oh, these are great questions. Shall we handle these now?
Sure, that'd be great. Whatever you're comfortable with.
All right. Does root competition become a problem? So root competition, in my view of the world, and by the way, there's so many different ways to do this and think about this. I'm just telling you what I've learned, and you can integrate it into your thinking. 1 second. My glasses got wet. Here's the thing. If you plant together at the same time, long, medium, and short-term crops, they will be synchronized in their development and they will work out the root situation. If you try to plant a banana right next to a fully actively growing breadfruit tree, that banana is going to be struggling. And I'll show you an example of where we turned a breadfruit orchard monoculture into an agroforest, and we had to synchronize everybody. So root competition is a function of timing, not, not that we're planting things together. How does one manage the watering? I've never done any irrigation here. I'm in Hulualoa. If you are in a dry area, what we've done by mulching is we're optimizing our retention of water. So you'll have to irrigate less, much less. And when it does rain, the water will percolate in. So where I have done watering irrigation, I always have used drip irrigation. I'm not sure I have any special knowledge about that you probably don't have already. You know what Ernst Götz says, who I've learned a lot from. He's a Swiss man who works all around the world in agroforestry. You plant the water. You're planting the water. So his farm in Brazil, which is about 1,200 acres, was a dry, gravelly, desolate land when he got it. And 30 years later, 1,200 acres has turned into a wet, humid environment with a stream running through it. So you plant the water. The difference between agroforestry and permaculture. I think agroforestry is something that permaculture, I started, I took a permaculture design course in 1990 in Wood Valley. So I started with permaculture. Permaculture is much more than just the agroforestry part. Permaculture is about energy systems, structures, infrastructure, and all those things. So I think their permaculture could fall under, agroforestry could fall under permaculture. Why to use a more systematic approach? And what are the benefits compared to a traditional pattern? That's a good question. The benefits of a systematic approach are twofold. The first one is it's easier to plan it on paper. The second one is it's easier to teach it and show people what's going on in terms of the layers, which if we have time, I was just about to do. If you don't want to adhere to a pattern and you want to do it like traditional style, that's great. That's probably has additional environmental benefits. If you're starting with a bare lot, you're usually starting with very poor soil. So I agree with you. Start with a cover crop. Give the land time to develop organic matter. You can also bring in mulch. You can haul in mulch and spread it around. That's expensive. It takes a lot of work, and it's not a replacement for actual active growth in the ground. When you put mulch on the land, it protects the soil and it adds nutrients and it helps feed the soil, but you don't have that root structure. And the root structure is what's giving you the water percolation effect by having woodier roots available. And it's also, you see, plants are talking to each other and exchanging nutrients, and the mycorrhizae are holding everything together in one superorganism. So mulch can't do that job. Mulch alone is just a way to start the system. Oh boy, this is a question about this is a question about rules against food crops in the front yard and height limits. You know, I've used an example. We have the pines here in Kona where nobody's allowed to grow food. I've used that as an example of like the anti-food security development. So that's a problem, I would say. We all need to be able to use our resources, our land, and our time to grow food and medicine if we want to. But if you have a height limit, you know, that's fine. You can have a bonsai agroforest if you want. We've planted agroforests in wine barrels, and you can have low, medium, and high, and you just prune them to be compatible. It's absolutely doable. You can have a 10 by 10, a 20 by 20, or a 5 by 5. It works. And by the way, the new trend in commercial agriculture in a lot of ways, and Ty can correct me if I'm wrong, is smaller, more compact trees. So avocados that are smaller, jackfruits that are pruned to 6 feet tall, mangoes that are small. So that actually works for us because now we can have more diversity and we have very good production off of those. Our job is just the pruning, which is also fine because we can use those prunings for mulch. How do we deter pigs and chickens? Yeah, that's a very good question. I have an electric fence. I didn't show it to you. It's about 18 inches high and it has 3 strands of wire. It costs $500 to put in, including the electric energizer and all of the posts and everything. And I've had 0 pigs for 25 years. So I'm a big electric fence fan. If you need something, like if there's a lot of kids around or there's a problem with electric fence in your area, then you'd have to put in a pig fence, of course, which is much more expensive, much more expensive. And the chickens, a dog. I just have a dog to chase them away. How much maintenance to control height? Not that much. I would say that front area takes about 2 hours every 8 weeks to control, to cut the nitrogen fixers, to prune things that need pruning, and just to cut things that are dying and just mulch them. Not that much. Why didn't you plant moringa? I did plant moringa. If you have your, oh, here's a question about planting into an existing agroforest and you want to plant low and ground cover. I'll show you an example of that. Do we usually plant trees with compost? I have heard that planting trees with composted soil can cause roots to not want to leave immediate area. Yeah, I just use mulch on top of the ground. I normally don't put any compost in the holes myself, but I think that's an individual decision. It seems to work fine without it for me. When is the right time to mulch? Every day, all the time. But especially when you start. And remember, the roots of your plants are not right underneath the canopy of the plants. The roots are going out at least twice the height of the canopy for most plants. They're way out there. So don't just mulch right underneath the canopy. I think that's something we learned from temperate agriculture, but the roots, if you're going to mulch just one area, do a donut beyond the canopy of your plants. How do you control the weed trees? Let's face it, we got weed trees, let's use them. So up there, I've got some African tulips. I just treat them like my mulch plants. They grow well, so why not? What kind of wildlife does it attract? We have lots of birds here. I think pretty much birds is what I could name. Avocado lacebug. I have not seen that here yet, but it might be on its way. What do you do? Who will eat the abundance of food grown if they aren't used? I'm not understanding this question. Food distribution and legal safety issues. We're not doing anything commercial here, so we don't have to worry about some of the standards, but of course we wash everything before we eat it, and we give away a lot of food. Is biodiversity the reason you need so little IPM, or do you just plant so heavily the losses are moot? Well, I would like to think it's the first one, the biodiversity. I can tell you during the bunchy top era of the 90s, all of our neighbors had bunchy top in their bananas here in Kona. And they were subject to the state people coming and removing them. And I have clumps of bananas all over. I never had any bunchy top. More recently, I had a little bit of bunchy top, but it was on a clump of bananas that's 25 years old. So I'm writing that off as just weakness of the bananas. Do we plant so heavily the losses are moot? Honestly, I haven't seen many losses recently, but you know, if something is not doing well, like I said before, I just let it go. Are we utilizing natives endemics as much as possible? Well, we're integrating them into our system. So we have, I didn't show you, we have mamaki interplanted, we have mauhauhele planted. That one, by the way, you can easily plant just from cuttings directly in the ground. We have lolu palm, which is native to this area. And so we integrate. We also have the native kalo varieties. So we're doing some of that. Do we do any composting? Composting for me is something I would do for just nursery use. Out in nature, the mulching it's a cold compost, and we don't really do much composting here. Amy says you probably have natural predators that are taking care of the bugs. I believe it. We have lots of Kalish pheasants and other birds around. We've got all kinds of wasps and moths and all kinds of things going on. Okay, so shall we take a break, Kalani, and then I can just finish my talk, and then you can go.
Great, that sounds perfect.
Okay.
Should we do about 11:05 to return? Great. Thanks.
Hey, Lonnie, you want to make a agroforest?
Hey, Jeff. Yeah, I mean, you already have that in your backyard.
Oh, you should see the spinach. Come over for some New Zealand spinach. Oh, what? It's all over. I'm not kidding. I mean, too much. But
Thanks,
it's
yeah.
a crop.
Well, we rely on you to distribute some of the plants for people to start their agroforests, like your chaya and other plants you have.
Oh, chaya. Hey, how much do you want? I want to cut it back. I got to cut it back. You know, if you want to distribute, I went to a food security talk by Dr. L.B. Miles from West Oahu, and he's doing some research on that. And there's no plan. The agriculture, vision is too narrow to include food security. They got more important things to do. And the governor, I don't know, he talked about it, but seems like lip service, huh? I mean, and I know Jari was saying, hey, everyone should grow their own, food. But what you call, I guess chaya is, something that is so easy. I mean, you gave me one stick and, you saw my trunk load that time. I think. But I want to, cut it back really because it's just too much right now. And, I eat it, but I only use 100 leaves in my 2-gallon pot of soup every time I make it.
Well, thank you, Jeff. And yeah, people on Oahu, you can contact Jeff Pang if you're interested in, and he's always happy to share his plant materials. And then before we get started again, I see that Caitlyn, thank you for posting something in the chat. Looks like another agroforestry webinar. So I'll definitely be interested in seeing what that's about.
Are we ready to go?
It's good. Thank you, Craig.
Okay. All right. So thank you everyone for hanging in there and all the good energy with the questions. Those were amazing questions. Caitlin and I were just remarking on how valuable the questions are. So that's really exciting. The webinar that Caitlin just posted to the chat, that is, we are working with the Pacific Island Farmers Organization Network in Fiji to host this. So it's a free webinar. You might be interested in tuning in on that if you're interested in breadfruit and agroforestry. All right. So we have another question from Ariel about incorporating plants with mature plants, and I'm going to go into that now. Oops. Sorry, one moment. All right. So again, this is the little area that I just walked through, which is now well above my head. This photo is from about a month ago. So what I'm going to talk about is the Agriforce design tool. Then I'm going to show you some more examples of how this is implemented. The Agroforestry design tool is a free tool. We built it with the help of NRCS, and it's available at agroforestryx.com. And it's live now. It's an educational tool, and it assists you in your design. It's not customized enough to give you a final design. It just assists you in coming up with the design and thinking about your spacing, your planting patterns, helping you select species, and then visualizing how it will look over time. We have models for growth in our tool, so you can actually see things growing. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you a brief introduction to the tool, then I'm going to go into the tool and give you a live demo. So the tool, this is the home page of the tool. Here, you set up an account, and what happens is the tool is based upon planting patterns. So we had to figure out how we were going to make this accessible to people. And so we decided to come at it from planting patterns. So we have a number of planting patterns that we have developed and that that the user can select from. And these are just 3 of them. There's, on the left, there's a 4-layer complex, and then in the middle, a 4-layer simplified, and a 2-layer low-high. So we have both complex and simplified patterns. So you start your design by picking a pattern. And you'll notice the color coding and everything is just like what I presented earlier. So the patterns themselves, you have to adapt on your own to your site. The patterns are 100 feet by 100 feet. This square here is 100 feet by 100 feet. So if you have a smaller site, like a home garden, you can work with this pattern and just pick the part of it that you want to plant in the size area that you have. So you can adapt this to a small area, a home garden. Or you can use this pattern and overlay it on a bigger area. Let's say this is about a 1/4 acre. So let's say you have 2 acres. You can overlay 8 of these or so onto 2 acres, and it will show you offline what the design will look for that 2 acres. The other thing you have to do on your own is adapt to your existing trees and shrubs. So if you already have an orchard of, let's say, breadfruit that's a monoculture, you'll have to adapt your existing orchard. You'll have to adapt the pattern to your existing orchard. So this, like I said, it's an assistant. These are examples of how to use it. On the left would be like a windbreak. You could take these 3 rows that are outlined in the orange dashed box, or for a home garden, pick what's within this orange dashed box. It's up to you. Remember, you're the designer. In the process of doing your design, once you've selected your long-term pattern, which is illustrated here, there's going to be a lot of unused space, as we showed before. So the long-term plants themselves, when planted alone, they always leave unused space, which needs to be filled unless you really like a lot of mowing and weed eating. So the tool itself for the patterns has both the long-term planting pattern and medium-term planting pattern. And we show them separately because when you put them together, they look really complex, but they're both there in the tool, and you select species for both long-term and medium-term. This is what they look like. I manually put them together. So I put long and medium term in this one drawing here. And when you look at that, then you can see there's very little open space and the rows become clear. So your rows are along the darker green lines, your planting rows. And then in between that, you have your pathways, which are either they can be cropped or they can be mowed or they can be used for just organic matter production. Okay, so once you've gone through selecting a pattern, then you select species. So those are broken down into long-term and medium-term species. After that, you have the option to manage your canopy size through pruning. So you can select whatever pruning size you feel is optimal for you. And there are default values that are given kind of based on our best recommendation, general recommendation. There are default sizes. So you can you select your pruning size. Pruning is very important. And I forgot to mention this in that Samoan example. You can see the breadfruits and the cacao are pruned. They were pruned maybe a couple of months before I took that picture. So pruning in these systems that I'm talking about is a very important part of the management. So here's an example. Let's see. Should I show, maybe I should go to the live tool. I'll go to the live tool. So I'm going to go here and here. All right, so this is the home page, and how do I? This is in my way here. Okay, I'm going to log in. I'm going to go to a project that I already set up before. So when you have an account, the nice thing about an account, which this is all free, by the way, is that you can come back and visit your projects. So this is a project I already set up so that we don't have to go through all the tedium of entering data and so forth. But I'm calling this Samoan Agroforestry. So this is based on that example, that photo that I showed you. So I gave it a name, Samoan Agroforestry. And then this tool is for the Pacific. So you can select your location. I selected American Samoa, but all of these other locations, including all the main Hawaiian Islands and a bunch of other island nations in the Pacific are available. If you don't want to be specific to any place, and the reason you would want to be specific is because native species are recommended for each of these places. You can pick any. If you pick any, then you're in a kind of a generic tropical location. But I'll take American Samoa. 130 inches per year. I put in the rainfall. How well does the soil drain? I'm going to say it's well drained. So all of these things, the rainfall, the soil drainage, the slope, elevation, that's all used to give you a recommended species list that you can select from. So I made all those selections, and then how big is your project? I said 1/10 of a hectare. Let's make it 1 acre. Oops, I'll just type in 1 acre. There's also the ability to get assistance with standards. So the USDA has a mixed Agriforce specification, and you can get assistance in meeting that specification, or you can get assistance with our own regenerative standard. I'm gonna select no restrictions for this, and then I hit proceed. Now select a planting pattern. I just selected pattern 1B. This is a 4-layer complex agroforest with 15-foot spacing between the rows. And I hit proceed, and now we can select species. So the species recommended, so here's a warning thing, organisms not protect 3 terms, okay, I don't know what that's about, let's fix that. So, so in these lists are our recommended species. So you can now look at the list of species, which according to our data and NRCS data and a bunch of references that we have are recommended for the environmental conditions that we entered into the project. So I picked the long-term low species. I have A'ali'i, and I picked Miley. Medium, I picked banana and plantain. And how come I didn't pick cacao? I think I inadvertently changed this, so it's not exactly the same as the agroforest that we looked at. Long-term highs, I'll pick breadfruit. I'm not going to pick dwarf coconut because we're going to have high coconuts. I'll take the mountain apple out. I'll just have breadfruit as the high. And now we have the long-term emergence. So we're going to have tall coconuts, and we're going to have pomoli. And I'll get rid of this one. So I just selected all the long terms. Now I have to pick the medium term. So these are the things that live only up to 4 years. So the medium term, there was no species selected. I'm going to pick, I'm going to pick pineapple and avapuhi here. The medium, I'm going to pick banana as a medium term. So bananas you can manage either for long term or medium term. A lot of people replant them early. Medium term highs. I'm going to have the edible hibiscus. I'll have tree basil and emergence. So for my emergence, I'll have papaya. Let's see. I don't see papaya. I'll pick how and Sesbania grandiflora. Now I hit proceed with those selections. Now I've got my pruning. I can select my pruning. In interest of time, I'm not going to mess with that. I'll just take the defaults. And then I'm going to go to the next one. And so now we have visualizations of how the system will look. So we have the initial planting. This is your pattern for, this is your guide for planting here. Then we have the 3-year view, which is a model of how it will look in 3 years. Again, the long term on the left, the medium term on the right, and they'll be planted together, obviously. We have the 3-year side view, and we also have the 10-year view. Okay, now I'm going to proceed. So these are static images at a snapshot in time. Then we have animations. So this is how the agroforest will grow in time. So this animates what you can expect of your forest growing. Now, what you'll see here is, first of all, you saw the medium terms disappear after 4 years from the left. And now you see the trees that you've selected, they're oscillating in size because they're getting pruned over time. So see the medium terms disappear, and now the other ones get pruned at their pruning size. And finally, we have a visualization in 3 dimensions, which shows you again, similar to the previous one, how this will develop over time. So for people who are not used to thinking about succession and how things change over time, this can be very educational. And then on the last page, you have, this is your project summary. So it shows you all the species you've picked, the visualizations and so forth. You can download this as a PDF, and you can also download a spreadsheet of your species, kind of like almost like a shopping list. So it tells you how many of each of the species you selected for the area you're going to plant. So if it's 1 acre, it will show you you'll need 72 breadfruits and X number of this, X number of that. So that's the tool, and it's meant to, as I say, assist you in your developing an agroforest. But you're still going to need to use your brain. Let me go back and I'll show you real quick. Do I have another 5 minutes, Kalani?
Yep.
Do I?
Yep. Yep, you're
Okay, I'm
good.
going to show you the example. I'm going to skip over one example, then I'm going to show you the retrofit example, which is for an existing orchard, which is that you want to diversify into agroforestry. Okay, so this is the one. So I think this is important since we had a few questions about this. This is a monoculture of breadfruit at the Breadfruit Institute on Kauai. And they have developed this as a multi-story agroforest. And so we started with a design which essentially retrofits the monoculture to turn it into a multi-story system. If you try to plant all the things you want in the understory of this monoculture, it's not going to do well. It's going to really struggle. If you put bananas under there and mamaki and even things that do well in shade like coffee or black pepper, they're not going to do well. Why? Because they're not synchronized. Everything has to be synchronized. Right now, this orchard is fully occupied above ground and below ground. And the message in that system, if you want to put it really simply, is we got this. We're not inviting any new guests at this time. So what we had to do was what we call an intervention, which is we're going to synchronize the breadfruit trees with our new planting. And we do that above ground and below ground. So we prune the trees heavily. And by the way, this looks kind of brutal, and it is kind of brutal, but those trees were almost unharvestable because they were so tall anyway. And breadfruit is one of those trees that really is invigorated by pruning, and it comes back quickly and produces a lot of fruit soon. So we pruned them. All of that organic matter went into the chipper and was turned into mulch. So that took care of the above ground. Essentially, now the breadfruit trees are in an active state of regrowth. From this moment on, after pruning, the breadfruit trees are regrowing, and they are actually allowing other things to grow under them and diversify. So if we did nothing, nature would explode in a wave of what we call weeds. Below ground, we also did an intervention. This was old sugarcane land and had been compacted through decades of machine work and also all the mowing that had been done since these trees were planted. So we, by hand, loosened up the soil, which in areas had very poor drainage, was very clayey, and so we had to loosen it up. The reason we did this by hand was we didn't want to do too much damage with machines to the existing root systems. If you smash up and cut into big underground roots, that's a wound that's hard to heal for the tree. So we just did this with pitchforks and human labor as best we could. And then we put compost on top of that and the mulch that we made on top of that. So now we're ready to plant. It's go time. And so we planted super densely along those rows. This picture doesn't really do justice to it, but we planted vegetables. We had an expert in organic vegetable cultivation helped with the design. So we planted about on 1 foot centers, the whole thing with vegetables. We planted our medium, low, medium and lows. For long-term crops, we planted medium-term stuff like papayas and cassava and things like that. And this is Diane Rigoni's picture. This is after about 2 to 3 months. You can see the veggies, really the veggies are dominating. However, underneath this are the medium and long-term crops. They're there. And if you're wondering, the netting is to keep the chickens out, which are so damaging on Kauai. And so this is after the vegetables are gone. So this is about 6 months into it. You can see now we're starting to see our bananas coming up. There's each section has a different understory crop. So we had things like cacao, cardamom, vanilla, all coming up in the understory. And our next wave of harvest will be this taro and cassava. Okay, I think I'll end it there. I have more stuff, but I think I'll end it there. Thank you for your time, your amazing questions. And I'll just sit back and enjoy the rest of the webinar.
Great, thank you so much, Craig. I see some Zoom hand applause, but that was really amazing. And I hope for those of you who, if this is something new, I hope your mind is kind of blown. But really, really, thank you so much. And, actually, my background is in native plants and conservation and forestry. And, but you really inspired me to get more into agroforestry and try to promote that through this position with the people that I meet. So thank you for the work you're doing. And was lucky to attend one of your workshops over a couple of days on Oahu a few years ago. And wondering if you have plans for any more workshops in the next year or two. I think you're muted.
I hope to do more. I've been working with Kekula Nui o Waimanalo and the workshop series. I think that's just for the Waimanalo community, but we certainly can expand that out. And I think this is the time, it's the time when people are really interested in food security and regenerating degraded landscapes. So I'm game. Just tell me where to go.
Great. Thank you. Well, we'll keep in touch over the years. Definitely. Thanks a lot. Well, I guess to fill up our remaining time to follow up on that excellent presentation, I'd like to just share a few little tidbits and some resources from CTAR. And then we'll split off into our local groups. So let me share my screen. I have so many things going on. Great. So first of all, I just wanted to share, this is just a poo-poo, just a little appetizer and taste. There's so much continued learning, and we look forward to future workshops and webinars, such as the one that Caitlyn posted. But we do have a lot of resources within our college and our faculty, which you may have already met. For example, we heard from Dr. Radovich. He was at least somewhat involved with that installation at the Waimanalo Research Station. So he's with the Sustainable and Organic Agriculture Program. And we also have many other partners in that team. You heard from Emily Kirk earlier, who does fruit trees on Kauai. I'm even listed on this page somewhere. But we have, there were so many interesting ideas, great concepts that were brought up, things such as intercropping. And, on different levels, different types of systems, we have researchers who have a lot of information on that type of practice. So I don't think we heard from Dr. Kunhui Wong this year, but she's out there, really great information on sustainable pest management and cropping cover. So she has a lot of information on cover crops, insectary plants, and soil health, and really, really great presentations and handbooks, publications. Dr. Travis Idle is our forestry professor and also does work in agroforestry. And our extension forester is JB Friday, Dr. JB Friday, and he'll present to us on native plants later. Dr. Noah Lincoln works, has a background in Kona, from Kona or Kohala, and working with the, some of those traditional systems, the sweet potato fields in Kohala, working with ulu and sugarcane, traditional crops. And he's also involved with the Breadfruit Institute, and they have a lot of great resources, including propagation guides. So even, propagation techniques. One thing I learned recently from them was doing root cuttings of ulu before we just kind of dug up roots, shoots that came up. So a lot of great information out there. Dr. Skip Bittenbender, he's retired now, but he, for many years, did a lot of work with coffee, cacao, and kava. So great crops for the agroforest. And just wanted to share Craig's website. Really, really great information. And if you go to the public library system in the Hawaiian reference section, there are really, really great books on many topics, including agroforestry and gardening. But all of these books are also available, that Craig has put together, are also available for free. The chapters are available on his website. This agroforestry guides is a great one. Specialty crops, just beautiful, beautiful profiles of different crops such as kava and many others. Really, really in-depth information. And traditional trees, trees that are so useful for just so many, just such a variety of uses, from timber to non-timber forest products. I mean, fiber, flowers, foliage, food. And somebody was asking about tree planting. At least for urban areas, we do have some pretty solid guidelines on tree planting. And the current recommendation, at least for urban areas, is to avoid mixing compost into the planting hole. So you can look at this further if you just look through our CTAR publications, planting a tree. But just to stop sharing for a minute, can anybody, just real quick, anybody want to just unmute yourself and throw out some ideas and share, what are some kind of products that you would like to get out of an agroforest? What would you like to plant, whether it be some flowers or some food? Anybody want to jump in?
think that was breadfruit flower.
Oh, breadfruit flower. Yeah, and that's what Caitlyn was talking all about. And we have a lot of growers on Oahu that I'm aware of, or some of the food hubs that are really getting into that as well, like at Kahumana Farm. Saleh, the manager there, he's getting a lot of breadfruit from the local community there in Waianae, drying it and making flour. Anybody else? Anybody want to jump in? I see somebody in the text saying soursop and abu. Really tasty fruits. Well, and do we have any lay makers in the group? Any artists, flower arrangers, people into fashion?
I think there was a question here before about integrating ornamentals into a system like that too.
Yeah, definitely. I think, Craig just laid the groundwork, just gave a really nice overview, but really it's up to your creativity and imagination as far as what you can incorporate into your system. And you might have just a small backyard area. So, maybe you're limited on what you can plant, but if you just look through some of these different kinds of specialty crops, there's just so much out there as far as food crops. But I think some of the traditional trees, things like, bauke maybe, for example, for making kapa, or other plants for fiber. Mamaki, as was mentioned, for medicinal uses or just a nice tea. Things for enjoyment like betel nut, kava. Kukui can be used for, just so many things, making beautiful lei, arrangements, hula implements, making inamona. A lot of different uses, things for perfume, leis and flowers, roofing material, home building material. Yes.
We have a question on Big Island. Where do you get these plants? How can you source them?
That's a good question. That's always a challenge, but reach out to your local nurseries, to your friends, your community. There's so many circles. For example, I often used to drink kava on Fridays with Dr. Bittenbender, and we always get the question like, oh, where do you get these plants, or how do we, who's doing what? There's so many different circles. Sometimes maybe they're a little exclusive to outsiders, but maybe there's the groups at Stadium Park that just sit around and drink kava on certain days, and they have their own resources within their communities, whether they're from different parts of Micronesia or Fiji or Tonga. So, there's people who share with their communities. There's always different institutes, Breadfruit Institute. You can always reach out to them on each island. Maybe on Kauai. James, you want to share something?
I was going to say for kava, at least, I'm not sure on the neighbor islands, but here the Kauai Invasive Species Council has been doing projects trying to replace the invasive false kava with native Hawaiian cultivars. So it might be worth reaching out to them and seeing if they have some. I know seed-wise, there's a few places, I'm blanking on the name of it. There's a seed company on Molokai that's selling native Hawaiian plant seeds, ethically sourced. Hawaii Seed Growers Network, I think, has a few natives as well. And then for cuttings, I would say also look into your local botanical gardens and look for plant sales there. I know Kalani was involved with one at Lion Arboretum. Lima Woolley here had one last weekend or the weekend before. And a lot of times you'll find stuff that you can't get anywhere else there. So good excuse to go to the gardens anyway.
Thanks, James. And you are master gardeners now. You are a resource. You have your network of classmates and friends, fellow master gardeners, but also you are connected with the college. You are part of the extension system. Reach out to your extension agents. your faculty. For example, hey, let's say you want to set up a little system, maybe some shade-grown coffee in your backyard. You're looking for some Gliricidia branch cuttings to plant for your shade. Hey, we have some at the research station, at Waimanalo Research Station. Contact us. Maybe we can work it out and get you some cuttings, things like that. Maybe you're interested in some new moringa varieties. Well, Dr. Radovich, that's one of his projects he works on. Reach out to him, see if you can get some seeds or some cuttings from him.
Alani,
Yes.
hi. Could I add to resources the question about mulch? He was saying that mulch is a good way to get started, and but he also mentioned that it's expensive and a lot of work. Well, in this urban environment in Honolulu, and probably elsewhere as well, it's easy to get mulch if you're just at the right place at the right time, because my neighbor was having his mango trees and lychee trees trimmed, and I just asked the workers if they would like to dump it in front of my house, and that's what they did. You have to have a space so they can easily do it and just dump the truck. So just by chance, I have a couple years worth of mulch in my front yard. But also there's some kind of a list that I added my name to, where the tree trimmers are looking for places or people who would like the mulch dumped at their place. Now, nobody's ever contacted me, but I live up Wilhelmina Rise, so nobody's going to want to drive their truck up to me. So I was just lucky by chance that my neighbor had some tree trimmers, but it's the second time it's happened for me. So, it's totally feasible.
Great. Thank you, Barbara. And that's a good point. Your local tree trimmers, definitely reach out to them. And I'd say for mulch, try and find it from as local a source as possible to avoid transporting invasive species, such as little fire ant or coconut rhinoceros beetle. So if it's next door, that's perfect. But what Craig's doing is growing his own mulch. You grow your trees and then you cut them and lay them down. And, it's great if you can chip stuff, but you don't have to. When I was volunteering with the Island Schools program, we had our third graders using loppers, just chopping things up, and with enough muscle power, even with little third graders, I mean, in no time at all, they turned those branches into usable mulch or things that could be composted. So real quick, I just want to share just real briefly, just some other ideas just to touch upon some of these things we were discussing. I just want to throw out just a different idea because so many of us are interested in growing edible crops and growing our vegetables. And these are pictures I stole straight from Craig and his publications. And so we've been over this. This is just something a little different because of some of the things I've studied in school, but there are different styles of tropical agroforestry from around, or even non-tropical agroforestry from around the world. And this is in Africa, but there are dry tropics. And, water is really one of the main limitations for plant growth. And so, up where Craig is, it's nice and wet, good rainfall and cloud cover often. So, things are growing really lush. But here, this is still a forest, even if you have a lot of open space, and you can incorporate grazing animals under your trees, nitrogen fixing trees, which have a lot of uses and resources available. And so we've been through all of this, but just wanted to share just some alternatives for our lettuce and kale and cabbage, things we love. And these are from Craig Elovich as well, but just some different things that you would never really think of eating. He mentioned cassava, and we're used to that tapioca, that starch that the roots produce. And these are great. These roots can stay in the ground. And when you harvest it though, you do need to prepare it pretty quickly. But a lot of people don't really know that, actually the leaves are a great vegetable. They need to be cooked because they contain cyanide, just like the roots. But a wonderful vegetable and really, heavily used in some places. And how apparently has edible leaves, mainly the tender new leaves. I would definitely cook it. And, this is more of a, maybe you can consider it a famine food, something that it's not really necessarily something you'll want to be cultivating for your food, but just know that, these are resources that are out there, that there are alternatives. One thing I will say is that noni as well apparently has edible leaves in addition to fruits, which you might like to use for medicinal purposes. But one thing I'll say though about some of these vegetable alternatives is that, plants do have a lot of natural defenses. They make an incredible diversity of compounds. Plants are way more complex than humans genetically, and they make everything. They're great chemical factories. And so, including, their structures. So they can be tough and unpalatable, poorly digestible. They might have anti-nutritive factors. And so, most of them are best cooked. And just, be careful, just don't overdo it. Wing bean is a great vegetable crop, but also has some edible leaves. There are, beans and other things out there where you can eat the tender young leaves. Bitter melon is another one. Edible fruits, don't eat the fully ripe ones, these orange ones, but the green fruits are edible. But the leaves, wonderful to use, the young shoots and leaves. And even weeds, there are edible weeds, hey, make use of them. Amaranth, the leaves are edible. Some of them are grown also for ornamental purposes. And there's some, some people like to incorporate the seeds, as you can see down here, the seed heads or flower heads, whereas some people use the leaves more. Purslane is another weed that just in some places, sometimes of the year will just pop up like crazy and be so abundant. And then, it's a weed, so you're busy fighting it, but you could just go out and harvest it, stir fry it lightly with some other things, and it's a wonderful vegetable. In fact, I saw it years ago being sold at Whole Foods in Kahala, and it was from Kaimuki Farms. But I remember that year there was a lot of purslane growing in the neighborhood and where I lived. And then after that, there wasn't much left. So I think somebody harvested it all and sold it to Whole Foods. But we have some plants that are grown, that are desirable for their leaves. And so moringa is a great one. You can see this publication here from agroforestry.org or agroforestry.net. And just a wonderful addition to your yard. It has an upright growth pattern, so it doesn't take up a lot of space. It turns into a large tree, but it's easy to manage because you just pollard it. So that's the practice. You just cut it down at waist height or chest height or whatever height, and it'll always send out new shoots, nice new shoots for you to collect the leaves. And you can also use the fruits. They might call it drumstick in some places. And, of course, now it's getting really popular, on the mainland because it's being called a superfood. So you can find even moringa powder. And, this is even a product that some of our farmers are growing and selling on the mainland and other big markets. Katuk is another tree or shrub with edible leaves. And these have a really delicious flavor, in my opinion, and can be eaten raw or cooked. But like I mentioned, don't overdo it. There were some cases of people getting lung damage because they were so, they thought it was so wonderful that they were juicing it or blending it into smoothies and consuming large quantities of it every day. And that led to some health problems. So just, be aware that, for a lot of these things, it's not smart to overdo it. And that's the wonderful thing about an agroforest is that there is quite a bit of diversity there. And chaya was mentioned is another tree with edible leaves, really nice when you cook them. They do have cyanide like cassava, so you do need to cook it, but very nutritious and just such a hardy tree that's easy to grow. And especially if you're from a drier area, really it's so easy to propagate. You break off a branch, stick it in the ground, and it'll grow, needs pretty much no water. And it will grow large, it'll topple over. So you just want to just prune it back to keep it manageable. But But, I've had this, like, for events, I've given away cuttings, and then the leftovers I threw in the driveway, and they've sat out in the hot sun for months and still had green leaves on them, and I was able to plant them and grow them out. So it's a really tough and hardy tree. And I'm missing a picture of Bele, but that's the edible hibiscus. So anyway, just a quick presentation, and that's what I wanted to share. So just to give you some alternatives and some ideas, especially, for those of you who have thoughts about sustainability. Sustainable agriculture, there's always alternatives to the way we do things. And we have our agents who are always working on finding better ways to grow the vegetables that our farmers want to grow for the market. And so we'll always have a market for lettuce and kale and all these crops that we're used to eating in our fancy restaurants. But, like last year when the pandemic first came and people were very worried about their food security, there are alternatives, ways to have edible and nutritious food that maybe could contribute to our food security or our diversity or our sustainability. And like, Craig's model there in his backyard, 0 inputs other than time and hard work. But he's using what nature's providing. Like he mentioned, he's not putting down any fertilizer. He's not really watering perhaps once plants are established, there's no watering necessary. So the only inputs are what nature provides him, and quite a bit of hard work. But so, just to throw out some of these ideas for you and get people thinking about different alternatives when it comes to sustainability. So, thank you. And Ferdinand's got a good point. Don't plant moringa near your plumbing. So with trees, there is an issue of interference with infrastructure, especially in Honolulu where it's so dense. But even I saw in that picture that Craig had of NTBG, big open botanical garden, but there was a water line coming through that area. So with trees, the main way that, people are always worried, we get questions on the helpline about, oh, are these tree roots invasive? Are they gonna mess with my sewer pipe or whatever? The main concern with trees is really, you want to envision what they're gonna be like full grown, what size they're supposed to be. And think about it in 10, 15, 30, 50 years, and how big is that stump gonna get? And you really wanna avoid planting that near your pipes, your infrastructure, because that has so much strength to push on things. And then some of the major structural roots. But after that, most of those roots, they'll, like Craig said, they'll travel all over the place. But generally the smaller roots are not so much of a concern for your pipes. So just the main thing is to really think about, okay, how big is that stump going to get? So don't plant your mango tree, 2 feet away from a wall or a sidewalk, because of, in 30 years that's going to be expanding and pushing out. All right. Well, that's about all I have. Any other questions or comments before we sign off?
And Lanai, you mentioned about not planting close to the sidewalk. A friend of mine mentioned that their neighbors had to pay for the sidewalk renovation the city was going to do because it was cracking, and if your roots are doing the cracking, you pay for it.
Thanks, Jeff. Great comment. Yeah. So, there were a lot of great concepts that were brought up today, and the Agroforestry X tool really helps to get you visualizing how things will be changing over time. And really, this is just an exercise in really agroforestry is using it's using just so many multiple layers, height and space and time. So, those are really great things to be thinking about. It's too often when we walk through a landscape, we just see it as a snapshot, but really everything is always changing. So I hope this gets you thinking about your long range planning when you're doing your gardening.
Kalani, I just wanted to add also, I put it in the chat, but for folks who are interested in this, there are 2 books that I really enjoyed on this subject are Gaviotas, A Village to Reinvent the World, which is about a kind of intentional community that got set up down in South America, where they turned kind of hostile land into a living forest by kind of talking about the same principles that Craig was discussing today. And it's a really great kind of overview of a community and how they kind of do this over a long term. The other one, especially if you know someone in temperate areas who's interested in this, is there's a book called Paradise Lot, 2 Plant Geeks, 1/10 of an Acre, and the Making of an Edible Garden Oasis in the City. And it's about 2 guys who sat there and took basically a suburban lot and turned it into a small food forest. I forget exactly where, I think it was New Jersey, but I think it's so wonderful to see something that's a tropical resource when we're so used to seeing temperate resources. If you do know folks in temperate areas who are interested, it's a pretty good quick read. And thank you both, Kalani and Craig. I learned so much today. I have so many pages of notes. This is just overwhelmingly wonderful.
Awesome. Yeah, definitely. It was such a pleasure. Thank you, Craig. Really, really we're so excited, and we really feel fortunate that you gave us your time.
Thank you. I feel the same way. Thank you so much, everybody.
All right. Well, we can call it a day, but we'll switch over to our local group meetings. And thanks a lot, everybody.